Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you to our first session of the European Parliament Youth Dialogue, the first ever dialogue that brings together the youth and MEPs from 4 different political groups. I am Charlie Brocard. I will be moderating this session, and I am board member at Generation Climate Europe. Today, we will discuss aviation, shipping, and the EU emission trading system. This is actually a very hot topic, as the Commission is expected to release its plan on the EU ETS in June next month. In addition, member states discussed the implications of extending a carbon market to the transport sector at the beginning of the week on Monday and Tuesday in Brussels. And therefore, this session is really timely, and we have the chance to have 4 very distinguished speakers that will be here to give you a sense of what they think about the EU ETS and exchange with you on this topic. Generation Climate Europe is the largest coalition of youth-led networks at the European level, pushing for stronger action from the EU on climate and environmental issues. We bring together 460 national organizations across 47 countries in Europe. And therefore, we are guided by the voices of 20 million Europeans. Our aim is really to facilitate internal coordination between our member organizations, but also make sure that the youth also has a say in the different mechanisms that the EU is putting in place. And this dialogue is actually a very good example of that. Today, we have the pleasure to host 4 different members of the European Parliament who are working on the EU emission trading system. First, I would like to say hello and to welcome Ms. Silvia Modig. She's a member of the left in Parliament. She's a Finnish politician and a former journalist. She has acted as a shadow rapporteur on the climate law that was adopted last October. Then I would like to welcome Mr. Michael Bloss. Hi, Mr. Bloss. Michael Bloss is from the Greens. He originates from Germany, and he has worked a long time on the EU ETS file as well as shadow rapporteur for the Greens. Then, as a third participant, I would like to welcome Ms. Jute Guteland. Hi. She's a member of the Socialists and Democrats in Parliament, and she's a Swedish politician that joined the European Parliament in 2014. She has worked as an S&D coordinator on the Committee for the Environment, Public Health and Food Security, among other activities. Lastly, we will be able to hear from Catherine Chabot. She's a Renew MEP. She's not with us right now, but she will join us a bit later. She's a French journalist, ex-journalist and ex-sailor that joined politics quite recently. She also served as a shadow on the EU ETS file regarding maritime topics. And unfortunately, no member from the EPP was able to join us today. However, we have here a very, very nice panel, so I expect a very nice conversation going on. Before I give you a sense of the structure of the session, I'm very excited to announce as well that the session will be graphically recorded. Fanny from Sketching on the Move will be here in the backstage, showing you some of the best quotes and also giving you a visual support on the conversation that we'll have going on. Here you can see her blank screen, and we'll be able to show it at 2 different moments during the conversation for you to also get a sense of what is happening in the backstage. And now a bit about the structure of this dialogue. This dialogue will last for 1 hour and a half, and we'll first address the EU ETS. Then we'll go over to aviation and how this sector is really crucial for reducing our GHG emissions. And lastly, we'll talk about shipping, which is a topic we do not address as much as we should, and it's quite important that we do. We'll also have Q&As, questions and answers, quite regularly across the whole event. We'll have Q&As after each of the 3 blocks I just announced. And therefore, I really encourage you to post in your comments, your questions, your opinions as well in the comments here. and we'll be able to take some of them during the discussion, but also during the Q&A. We'll also end up with another Q&A at the very end of the dialogue. Now I would like to give the floor to Dario Pagna, who is a member of GCE, project co-lead on rail transport. He is here to give you a glimpse about what is the EU ETS, because it is quite a technical topic, I know. And therefore, it's really nice to have him to give you an overview of what it is and why is it key to reduce our GHG emissions. Please, Dario, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I will actually focus on a short overview of the sectors and also give you some reasons for the past emission increases. Because undeniably, we can say that both sectors are symptoms of a globalized world economy and society. For shipping, the emission increases are closely linked to global trade policy. Fewer barriers to trade increase the overall amount of trade and therefore the need to move raw materials, goods, and products. For aviation, the increase is often perceived to be linked to economic and cultural factors, namely the rise of the middle classes being able to afford and also inhibiting an increasing desire to travel to distant places. There are also low-cost carriers facilitating cheap weekend city trips on a budget for the many. But we can also look at the emission increases, especially in aviation, from a global regulatory perspective. International aviation is so far not counted towards any country's emission budgets, in part because countries will not want to reduce their global connectivity, often for economic reasons. The Paris Agreement does not include non-CO2 effects from aviation, meaning that the contribution of aviation to climate change is often downplayed. Lastly, there's a race to the bottom taking place. Countries do not want to enforce prices on local airlines and passengers because they could simply start flying from neighboring airports. So where is the issue? If we unite and all EU countries agree on reducing the emissions, an increasing CO2 price would lead to fewer passengers and more investment in carbon-neutral aviation. But I would like to critically engage today and ask, who are the passengers that will not fly? Today, let's discuss carbon inequality and the fact that flying is not as common as many people with privilege care to believe. While passenger cost per kilometer dropped vastly and average income has increased, travel has become more broadly available. But don't be fooled, flight emissions are still an issue of global economic elite. The data suggests that only 11% of world population is traveled by air in 2018, with only 4% at most taking international flights. The percentile of the most frequent flyers, that is less than 1% of the global population, likely counts for more than half of the total emissions from passenger air travel. Individual users of private aircraft contribute obscene amounts of emissions, 7,500 tons of carbon per year. 1,000 users of private aircraft therefore emit while flying the equivalent of what 1 million average Europeans emit in all areas of life. In short, the richer a person, the greater the share of emissions from mobility, and even more so in air travel. At EU level, the share of emissions from aviation within the top 10% of emitters is 13%, whereas for the top 1% of emitters, it is 41%. I would like to repeat that. So the top 1% of emitters emit 41% of their carbon from flying. Just for comparison, the EU bottom 50% of emitters emit close to 0% during flights, but close to half of their emissions from life essentials, food and housing. So, despite comparatively non-widespread use of air travel, it is already contributing significantly to greenhouse gas emissions. I would like to ask our MEPs today to think critically about the ETS. As price increases for tickets will need to be extremely high to deter top emitters, and earners for that matter, from countries like Luxembourg or Germany to reduce flying, but the same price applied for carbon-intensive heating and cooling may make surviving in Romania's hot summers and cold winters very expensive. For shipping, the situation is quite different. It is the sector carrying around 80% of global trade and is therefore responsible for more than 2% of global emissions. That might seem low, but it is more than Germany. Reasons for the emission increases are, for example, the rise of export-focused economies, the expansion of intra-trade, that is, trade in similar goods between countries. A good example of that is Germans buying Japanese cars and Americans buying German cars, and sliced up value chains, so goods produced in various stages in different parts of the world. All developments have facilitated more complex supply chains and thereby increasing the amount of shipping and the associated emissions. Amid concern that rising sea levels threaten the future of their countries, the Pacific nations of Marshall Islands and Solomon Islands recently called on the IMO, that is the International Maritime Organization, a UN agency, to introduce a $100 per ton levy on greenhouse gas emissions. The IMO currently targets a 70% carbon and 50% greenhouse gas emission reductions until 2050. This is not in line with the Paris Agreement. Now, ironically, innovation-oriented industrial giants are nowadays often calling for tougher regulations than many governments. And while I'm not here to sell you any kind of technological optimism, it really is surprising that, according to the CEO of Maersk, the world's largest container shipping line and vessel operator, tackling climate change in the shipping industry would translate into something like 6 cents per pair of sneakers. We should obviously understand that statement critically, but with that input in mind, I would like to lead over to our first topical block, the ETS.
Thank you very much, Dario. I think that's really important what you just said, because we have to be on the same page here regarding the impact of aviation and shipping. I think the key takeaways here is that when we talk about aviation, and this is also something to consider for the debate afterwards, we should also consider an environmental justice approach, because the richest are the biggest emitters, as Dario just said. It must therefore be regulated further. And I would also like to welcome Ms. Catherine Chabot. Thank you very much for joining us. Before we move to the next block, I think it is important that you understand the EU ETS is a carbon market, and therefore Flora Marchioro from Generation Climate Europe, project co-lead on clean road transport, will be able to explain you a bit more and a bit better why it is important actually to consider carbon markets to reduce GHG emission from shipping and aviation. Flora?
Hi, everyone. So let's give an overview of what the ETS is, so emission trading system. The ETS was introduced in 2005 for certain industries that at that time were responsible for about 40% of the EU total greenhouse gas emissions. And these industries were manufacturing, power generation, and transport. However, until now, the ETS has not addressed the transport sector much, as it only covers commercial flights within the European Economic Area. What characterizes the ETS compared to regulation and standards is that it's a market-based system. This means that the ETS creates an economic incentives for polluters to cut their emissions. But how does it do so? Well, usually the ETS is defined as a cap and trade system, which is a technical way to describe a much simpler idea, in my opinion, namely sharing a pizza among friends. The first thing to do when sharing a pizza is to, for sure, set the size of the pizza to share. So in each trading phase the ETS revision, the EU does exactly that. It sets a cap on total emission that companies can produce in that specific phase. So now, for example, we are in the 4th phase, going from 2021 to 2030. Okay, so once the size of the pizza is decided, we have to set the size of the pizza slices. In the case of the ETS, once the total cap is set, this one is used to compute the fixed number of allowances issued each year. These allowances are both allocated for free to certain industries, which might, of course, be a problem, or auctioned. The key way for the ETS to reduce emissions is that over time, this fixed number of annual allowances is reduced, such that emissions allowed to be produced decrease with every year. So to recap, companies are supposed to hold enough allowances to cover their emissions. What happens if this is not the case? Well, at this point, coming back to our pizza example, we have to ensure that whoever is most hungry for pizza is going to get more slices, and that whoever is not hungry doesn't waste its slice. So if a company does not have enough allowances compared to its actual level of emissions, it can do one of these 3 things. It can either cut emissions by developing more sustainable ways of production, which should be the ideal. Second, it can buy more allowances from other companies, thus the trading. Third, it can pay a heavy fine. This whole setting makes sure that the system is cost effective. So a company that has extra allowances can either sell them or spare them for the following year. This way, companies that are effective in reducing their emissions are awarded by selling their permits to hungry companies that receive back the price of the permit, and the trading allows emissions to be cut where it costs the least to do so. So this is a general overview of what the ETS is, and we'll now see how it can be applied to aviation and shipping, ideally.
Thank you very much, Flora. Well, I think indeed the key point is that so far aviation and shipping have not been included into the EU ETS, although it has been instrumental in reducing emissions from other sectors. I would like to first turn to Mr. Michael Bloss. Why do you think what do you think has prevented the EU to have a more ambitious stance on this topic until now?
Okay, thank you very much. It's really nice that, first of all, you invite us all. I think it's one of the first debates where I see my fellow MEPs on this very important topic, and that we do it with the youth in the beginning. It's very cool. So, and I'm impressed by what you have already prepared and how you get deep into the topic. So allow me a little bit to zoom out a bit of it and think a little bit about what we actually want to achieve and why and how and we should do it. So what do we want to achieve? We have some problems. First is the actual cost for the society of CO2 emissions is not reflected in the price of a CO2 emission. No, the cost for 1 ton of CO2 for the current society is 180 euros. But the price of CO2 emission is not 180 euros. So you have some kind of, the public pays for the difference. And that's a problem in terms of democracy and in terms of who bears the cost, in terms of we have a polluters pay principle. So actually the best thing would be to just say, okay, 1 ton of CO2 emitting should cost 180 euros or 195 euros. But then also we want to have it fair. So we want to have we want to have this whole transition to decarbonize should be really done while keeping our societies together. So it must not be that then the poorer ones cannot actually, pay their rents because they have to pay so much for CO2 emissions, whilst the richer ones, they don't have a problem with it. So this is like two different objectives we need to get. And so what kind of instrument do we choose? I would choose, if I could choose, I would choose a tax, because that's easy. That's easy to apply. That's very it can be very targeted, and we can use the revenues and redistribute it. Now, problem is we at the European level, we are not allowed to have taxes. That's not our competence. So we have to think about different instruments. So we have regulatory instruments, like, for instance, saying all coal power plants have to shut down by the year 2030, or we can use a market instrument. And I think we always have to think which instrument works best in which way. So it's not limiting ourselves to the market instrument. Now, the market instrument is the ETS, and currently it is applied for the sectors of industry and for energy. And whilst we see now prices of above 50 euros, we saw for the first 10 years, while this instrument existed, prices only at around 5 euros, and these prices had almost no effect in actually reducing CO2 emissions, because that's also what we want. So we have to be very careful and really get it right, because a market is very difficult to compute. To build the architectures is difficult, and that it actually serves all the purposes. So what I'm suggesting, what the Greens suggest, is we have two goals with the current ETS. The most important ones are actually, getting rid of coal, because that's the low-hanging fruit. Coal is still the biggest CO2 pollutant in Europe, and getting rid of coal would very fastly drop our CO2 emissions, much more than aviation, by the way. I mean, I'm not saying that aviation also has to do this, but coal is bigger. The second thing, what we want to achieve, is really kickstarting the decarbonization of industry, because what we see in the current ETS is that CO2 emissions are reducing, but it comes almost only from the energy sector. And why in the energy sector? First, because we have supported renewable energies to an extent that they are now very competitive. So if you build now, for instance, new wind power plants, they are the cheapest in producing energy. So if you have coal or wind power, you would choose wind power just for economic reasons. But that has not worked just with the ETS. It has worked because we have putting a lot of subsidies in making them cheap. Second, in terms of slices, industry gets their slices for free, but there's no free pizza. So someone else has to pay the price for it, which is, in this case, the society, because the 180 euros is still there in terms of cost for the society. So we really need to kickstart the industry transition, doing the same what we did with the energy transition, so support it with subsidies, but then also like taking away the free slices and taking away the free allowances, so that they actually then transition as well, because they really have to transition. If you build a new steel plant today, this will last until 2050, and in 2050 it has to be decarbonized. So every new steel plant we build from today on, every new chemical plant has to be already climate neutral. And we do not have currently the best instruments to do it. So that's kind of that's what we are discussing in terms of energy and industry. Now, sorry, I'm not going to the aviation part so much, but because what we are also discussing is to have to extend it to transport and building, or to have a second ETS for transport and building. And here we Greens, we are we are suspicious about this idea because of different reasons. First of all, what I said in the beginning, it has to be fair. Increasing the price in the ETS for energy and industry to 60 euros, 100 euros has really little impact on the consumer price, on like the energy price, on my energy bill. If I have a high price, for instance, for the transport sector, where I need prices of around 200 euros in order for it to be effective, it will, like triple the bill that you pay at the fueling station. And that's actually not fair if poorer people will not get somehow a compensation for this. And on the European level, we do not have the competency to give compensations, direct payments to individuals. So I'm very skeptical about it, because I don't want that the poorer parts of our societies will pay a much bigger share of the transition. But we have here, we have regulatory policies. For instance, we can ban fossil cars from the year 2030 onwards. And that's already happening with the CO2 emission standard for cars, which is completely regulatory and which triggers investments from industry into building electric cars. So it's the investment of the industry that bears the cost, and not the consumers that pay the price at the fueling station. And that's what I'm looking for here in the transport and in the building sector, that it's actually these investments that will be triggered by regulatory policies. So I already took, I guess, much longer than I should have taken, but that's kind of how I see things. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Blas. I think what would be interesting is also to hear from you, Ms. Guteland, because there have been talks, as I was saying in the introduction, at the European Council at the beginning of the week. And they are working on a proposal at the European Commission level as well to make sure that the transport can be included. What do you think now is the priority? Because we've seen with Mr. Michael Blas that indeed there are some questions about the EU ETS system itself. Do you think that's a good way to go about this? And also, to go back to my first question, what do you think is the priority at the moment?
Yes, first of all, I would also like to say thank you for inviting me to this important discussion. And I, as well as Misha, feel very happy to be in this company, both talking to you and all the young participants in this dialogue. But I am also very happy to be in with my colleagues here, who I believe have very strong influence over these questions, and I hope that we will cooperate a lot during the upcoming year. That said, I really believe that the current ETS needs to be much sharper, and I would agree to many of the things that Misha mentioned. I would also like to mention that it is, of course, important and welcome to include the maritime sector in the ETS. I really believe that is a necessary step to make sure that every sector should contribute not only for the responsibility under the climate law, but also as respecting the Paris Agreement. I believe it's very clear that everyone should be part of this. But regarding the transport sector, I believe the most important thing is that it will be a reform for the transport sector that will deliver a result for climate. And then also that this reform is done in a way where we know that it will be very different in different member states, the situation. And because of the different economic situation in the member states, but also for different income groups, the result, if we include the transport sector in the ETS, and if we have a bigger price that will be paid from the car owners, then of course it will have very different result in different member states and among different income groups. So for me, it needs to be socially just, so we don't have a situation where those with less money have to pay much more of their salary for this transition. But I also want this transition to go faster in the transport sector. I don't want to have this very lame reform where we actually don't insist on a faster transition. We need the transport sector to change. We need to have different kind of cars, and we need people to change the behavior as well. It is not sustainable the way it is today. That said, I'm not very happy about including the transport sector in the ETS. But if it's to be done, then I think we need to have a very clear focus on both to make it still be a very ambitious reform, so that the transition is happening, but yet we need to have economic support system to help, so that it doesn't become very different in different member states and for different income groups. You can see that if in Sweden, there would be, for some households, maybe possible to continue to drive a very big car, a SUV, and then in another member state, it would maybe not even be possible for people who now own a car to even have a car with this reform, if it's the same for everyone. And therefore, we really need to think here how we can have the very right incentive if we include the transport sector.
Thank you very much, Ms. Guteland. I think it is quite interesting what you both said about including the transportation sector in the EU ETS or not, because it's indeed not the only way to diminish emissions from these sectors. However, I think road transportation might be a bit different than aviation and shipping, because as we've said in the beginning, aviation is really much more well, targeting aviation would have a higher impact on households that can actually afford it, because these are the ones that take planes. And for shipping, then it's much more like, I think it's a different question as well, which we'll address in the third block. Flora, I was wondering if you had any reactions to what Ms. Guteland and Mr. Bloss just said.
I agree that also youth around Europe are really concerned about the social inequality that the ETS might introduce. So I think we see your opinion, your point of view, that the ETS might not be, so a market-based system might not be the best way to tackle the problem of road transport, which is something that we use every day. People might use every day, especially outside cities. And there are other ways that are more regulatory, more than price related. So not to increase the price too much for lower income households, but to be able at the same time to tackle the problem. Still, I think I agree with Charlie that for aviation and shipping, it might be more interesting to actually include the ETS, to include these two sectors in the ETS. But we'll have time now to discuss about the two sectors specifically.
Thank you very much, Flora. I think we have some comments in the chat, which I think might be interesting. One comment asks what measures are being taken to strike a better price on carbon, and how will the EU ETS system prevent big players from controlling and potentially colluding to set carbon pricing? I would like to ask this question to Ms. Modig, if you are able to give a reaction on that.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you from my behalf also for organizing this. This is a good start for our work on renewing the ETS, and that is the question to that. That's the answer to that question. We must renew the ETS. I agree a lot with what Mrs. Guteland and what Mr. Bloss said here before. I'm very happy that both you raised the fact that we have to do this in a socially just way, because there's also always the political reality also to take into question. We also need the people and the citizens to feel that it is just, that it's fair, and they can be on board. Because this climate thing is also used in this polarized situation in Europe, where we are going very far from each other in discussions. And it is used, the fear of people of how will I be able to live my life? How will I be able to take the kids to school? Can we eat the same food we ate before? Can we ever go on a vacation before? Some forces use this as their political tools, and this is dividing us. So I think that of course it is morally right to do it in the socially just way, but it's also wise for the political reality to do it in the socially just way. And how to make it sharper, the ETS. I think my colleagues here have raised very, very important points there, which I agree on. The first thing is that we have too many allowances. It must do, the pot must be smaller. And as we now have the climate law soon after it passes the parliament, we have the target of being carbon neutral in 2050. We just have to act. So there will be changes for the better. We will be able to reduce, well, we have to, because we have this target, we have to reduce the emissions. And when we do that, we have to be really careful that we take away allowances in the same amount, rather even a little bit more, so that the price will go up. It's basic market economy that the less you have them for sale, the more expensive they are. The other one is the free allowances. We had in Envy the Court of Auditors report here a couple of months ago, and it stated very clearly that the free allowances have slowed down the progress. It has slowed down the transition, as it takes away the incentive to invest in new, cleaner technology. And the free allowances isn't the only problem, because, for example, in my country, Finland, and I know that this is in many countries the same way, those energy efficient industries that we have been giving these free allowances to are also the industries that many member states have their own national subsidies for. So we support those industries that emit the most in several different ways. And this is another thing that we should be able to tackle, which is, of course, for the EU very hard, but we have a lot of harmful subsidies for the environment and for the climate. And that is a waste of money, that we have big amounts of money working in the different directions. Just for example, when the central bank now in the COVID crisis made its purchase program, billions of euros went to support gas, oil, car industry, aviation, which of course is a waste of money when we should use this hard, difficult time to fast up the transition. So the free allowances also has to be taken into consideration, that we are also waiting for the carbon border adjustment mechanism proposal. And that comes on the same field. That the purpose of that one is that when we in Europe raise our ambition, we want a level playing field for our industry and our companies, so that you cannot produce something outside the EU with not taking your responsibility to the climate, and then coming with a cheaper product to the European market. So that is also one thing that why we don't need to protect these energy efficient industries anymore, because the carbon border mechanism will do that in its role. So those I think are quite essential. Then on maritime or transport in general, I do think that we must recognize that the transport sectors are very different. If we think about road transport and road mobility, it's a lot of private people in their private cars. And that has to be addressed then in a different way than just something that puts the prices up for everybody else. But for shipping and maritime, I think that it should be included in the ETS. I think that should be wise. But then we come again to the realities. I take again my own country, Finland, as an example. We are in the northern part of Europe. We are a country that lives on export, and most of our export is done by maritime shipping. So, and we are a country where there is cold most of the year. We have ice in the winter. That means that our ships are bigger, they are more heavier, they use more fuel. So just the political reality is that when we think about how to bring the maritime into the ETS, we have to take these things into consideration to make it fair and to get also the northern countries on board. And then just a few words on the aviation. I think that is a really tricky one. I don't have a clear view on how I see it at the best. Here in Finland, we have an initiative now on putting a tax on flying. And of course, I support that, but I see also problems in that. I would want the pressure to be on the companies, for the companies to have an initiative and incentive to try to find better ways to emit less, and not just put the price on the individual. Because let's be honest, I am the problem. Me who is flying all the time through Finland and Brussels and others, not the family that saves up all year to make that one holiday trip with the family somewhere south. They are not the problem. The frequent flyers, as we heard in these good presentations here in the beginning, are. So then I've been thinking about how about the progressive tax, where the more you fly, the more you pay. Then it wouldn't hit the family that has saved up all year, but it would hit frequent flyers like myself. I think that would be fair in a way. But then, as Misha well pointed out, tax is not in the EU competence. It's a question of the member states. But then also, I mean, to put the pressure on the companies to have the incentive, then put tax on kerosene. Now we are supporting the aviation business. Just to take away that support and put tax on kerosene would be a step forward. But then there are also things in aviation that could be done without, which I think that the ETS in a way then could work for. But for example, that we should only fly full planes, take away first class, pack it full with people, with the same emission, get as many people then move to another place, because now they can fly half empty. Another one is having better planning between the flight controls in different countries, so that we don't have any planes waiting for their turn to land up in the air in vain. There are things in what they do on the platform, how do you say, on airports, when they're on the ground, there are things there to cut down the emissions. These should be like these are easy things to do, but there must be some kind of regulatory thing that gives the incentive to the companies and to countries to do that. But yes, but these are also all things that we must take into consideration in the ETS. And I want to also state that if the Parliament's position to the climate law, where Jytte Guteland was the rapporteur, and in her very good report, we demanded that aviation and maritime transport is included, but we did not achieve it completely as strong as we would have wanted in the final law. But it's still there. It's still there, the idea. And in a way, a lot of decisions that I would have preferred to be solved in the climate law are now pushed to different questions, to ETS, to LULUCF, and other solutions. So we just chose a harder path for ourselves. But we have to keep going and then take regulation by regulation and see how we can screw up the level of ambition. I will stop here, Charlie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Madig. We are indeed a bit behind our schedule. So I guess we can just move to the second block, which is actually focusing on aviation, because you've made the perfect transition into this new block by also proposing some ways to make the transition in the aviation sector, because I think indeed the EU ETS is not the only tool that we can mobilize. In order to introduce this block, I would like to welcome Nadine Mingers, who is Clean Mobility Coordinator at Generation Climate Europe, to give us a bit of an overview as well, and what the youth thinks about the aviation sector. Nadine?
Yes, thanks so much, Charlie. Thanks everyone for being here. So now that we nicely zoomed out, I'm going to try and nicely zoom back in again and speak only about aviation in the ETS. I'm going to give a bit of a historic background. So CO2 emissions from aviation have been included in the ETS since 2012, actually. However, this only goes for domestic flights, meaning flights that arrive and depart within the EU. In addition, aviation is the only sector in the ETS that actually grew its emissions, roughly 30% since 2013. And just to give you a comparison, other sectors covered in the ETS, such as energy, coal, steel, and cement, they have managed to decrease their emissions by roughly 9% in the same period. So why is that the case? And there are two main reasons for it. The first one, as we already heard, is the historical surplus of free allowances or free CO2 permits. These have been given to heavy emitting industries based on a carbon leakage argumentation. Technical term, but carbon leakage is basically companies saying, okay, the rules are too strict here. I'm being forced to move my production abroad in a third country that have less ambitious climate targets in order to lower their production costs. This can then again lead to an increase in CO2 emissions or carbon leakage from the market. However, for airlines, this argument doesn't hold at all. As we just heard, only intra-EU flights are covered, and you cannot move an intra-EU flight abroad for logic reasons. The second reason why emissions are rising in aviation in the ETS is, again, it's only partially covering aviation, only domestic flights. However, international aviation emissions are increasing incredibly fast. They have in fact doubled since 1990. And just to put this a little bit into perspective, someone that is flying from London to New York and back generates roughly the same amount of emissions as an average person heating their house for the whole year. So by not addressing this as the EU has effectively missed out on 8 years of climate action to address these detrimental effects from international or long-haul flights. They have done so based on the argumentation that eventually there would be an international scheme who will cover all international flights. By a matter of fact, this year, this scheme is supposed to come. It's called Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme, or short CORSIA. Feel free to look it up. It's been created by the United Nations Body for Aviation, and it's kind of trying to coordinate international efforts on offsetting or compensating for aviation emissions and try and create a global level playing field. As said, it's going to be launched this year, and countries can opt in on a voluntary basis. So not companies opt in, but countries. And they can do so till 2027. However, this CORSIA scheme also has some major flaws. The first one is there's an extreme oversupply of cheap carbon offset credits. They will in fact cost less than €1 by a study from Transport and Environment. And the second flaw is it will account for emission reductions in sectors that are already calculated into member states' climate measures. So you have double counting, which is a bit like handing in one homework for 2 people. So it's cheating. So to cut it short, overall, opting in to this CORSIA scheme would weaken the EU's climate targets. However, this is being discussed this year for the revision of the emission trading system. And this is it from my side, and I'm very curious to hear what MEPs have to say.
Thanks, Nadine. I have to say I really loved the cheating metaphor. That's really, really telling. If Ms. Chabot is still here with us, I would like to hear from you, actually, because you're the only one that has not had the chance to speak yet. And I would like to know what's your reaction to this, because indeed the regulation of the aviation sector has been weak in the past years, and now we're seeing with CORSIA that the new mechanisms that are put in place are still super weak as well. So what do you think is the problem here, and where should we go to make sure that we address this burning issue?
Good evening to everyone. Sorry, I'm not an expert on aviation, just on shipping. I'm here to speak about shipping. I won't answer this question. If you have a question of maritime transport, I will, but not on this.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. That's great. Actually, we can also address another question during the maritime block. Well, I guess Mr. Bloss, if you'd like to address this question or actually give us a reaction on the new plans made by the UN body to tackle this question.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think that it's really not contested that we take away the free allowances from the aviation sector, because as you just heard, I mean, it doesn't make sense. You cannot, there's no risk of carbon leakage with a flight that goes from, I don't know, Helsinki to Brussels. It just cannot go somewhere else. So you have to applaud the lobbyists that actually made it possible to get free allowances for internal EU flights, because it's a weird idea from the start. Second, I think we have to think in the way of how can we make traveling possible without flying. I think because the idea is not that like no one travels anymore and we do not have this international, European exchange. But the point is that currently traveling with the train is much more costly and it takes much longer, and we just do not have so well so much investment also into like sustainable infrastructure than we have, for instance, in streets and roads, and then of course aviation is a problem because it's much too cheap. So we have to make it more expensive, as Sylvia already explained before, but it also means that we have to channel a lot of more money and investment into making the alternatives actually possible and achievable and possible for normal people to use the train, yeah, and so make it cheap. And then the bigger question is on the CORSIA scheme. So how do we do it for international flights, which are also, I'm not against international flights. It's important that people from Europe can also go somewhere else, and so that we have this international exchange. That's also important. But of course, it needs to be more expensive, and I'm in favor of including also this like international flights that are boarding and departing from Europe in the European ETS, because also I don't see a huge risk of carbon leakage. I mean, it could be possible that people then, I don't know, would meet in Minsk instead of Poland, but now also that's not possible really anymore. So there is also not a lot of carbon leakage risk in here. Still, there is like a risk of retaliation, from other countries like China. But the price that we see in CORSIA, they're really little, and I think we will not achieve prices in CORSIA that are as high that they have actually an impact on it. But also having said that, aviation is not my main concern. My main concern is getting rid of CO2, the low-hanging fruits in CO2 emissions, and that's more in the energy field. Yeah, so that's for the aviation. I think there is interesting regulatory possibilities. For instance, like not having flights inside countries anymore. For some countries that would work. for France, I think it's interesting. No, in France, you have such a good train system that it's actually faster than flights, and we also see that in places where we have this good train systems, flights actually vanish. So there is no flights currently between Frankfurt and Cologne because we have a really good train connection. There is. I hope that the flights between Berlin and Munich decreased by 2/3 when they started a fast train connection between Berlin and Munich. So the idea is, and my hope is, that we really get rid of internal flights in countries by improving the train connection, but also having much better trans-European railways.
Thank you very much. I guess this is actually, yes, Ms. Modi, you want to add something on this?
Yes, just briefly, and I saw that Jutta has the same ambition. This is what happens when you talk to politicians. We always have something to say. Misha spoke there very well. It's crazy with we must make big investment in rails. I'm 45 years old, and I was on my first Interrail when I was 17 and did that for years. The connections in Europe were better then than they are now, which is unbelievable that the progress has gone backwards. It is because of the cheap flights. Misha mentioned some of the examples from Germany. I know that, for example, in Spain, when the fast rail track was made between Madrid and Malaga, the flights decreased with 70%. Because actually it's more nicer to go that by a train. If you're, for example, traveling for business, it's much more pleasant for you. You come from the center from the city to the center from the city. It's much more, there are no security controls and others. So it is competitive. The train possibility is competitive, and we should do that. But then, of course, we must understand that all countries have their own different kind of challenges. Some are bigger, some are smaller, some are densely populated, some are sparsely populated. But this cannot be used as an excuse not to do anything. We can find ways where we can take that into account. And on the carbon leakage, just shortly, Charlie, to conclude. As well as I was a member of the Finnish Parliament, we did this study in the Environmental Committee, because the industries in Finland said that with us raising the emission reduction targets, there's going to be carbon leakage, and they're going to move their companies and their production somewhere else. And what we found in that was that there is a lot less carbon leakage than the industries give us think, that make us think. Because a company producing something, it doesn't only think about the cost of production. It needs several things to want to put a factory somewhere. They need they need workers with the sufficient expertise for whatever they are doing. They need a stable society where they know that they can act. They want a predictable political scene. So there are many other things also than just the cost of the production that influence the decision of companies. So that it's not such a big threat that some make believe, in my opinion.
Thank you. Yeah, it was actually a very interesting reaction. And I think to maybe sum it up for the audience as well, I think two of the main points that you all raised since the beginning of this block is also that we have to take care of our borders. So first with the carbon border adjustment mechanism that is upcoming. But on the other way, we also have to make sure that alternatives are possible. And I think the point on the rail transport is actually very interesting. Although I have something in the back of my mind, which is that if we encourage fast rail transport, then we have an impact that is kind of displaced from GHG emission to biodiversity loss. Because when you implement fast rail transport, when you have a bigger impact on land and bigger impact on the creatures and the entities that live on this land. And therefore, I think it must be also taken into account and maybe to maybe complexify a bit more this topic that we have today. But also regarding the third thing, which might be the third pillar, to cut harmful subsidies. We have a question from the audience, which I think is quite interesting. I would like to ask it to Ms. Gutteland. What is your stance on the European tax on kerosene being complementary to aviation being fully covered in the EU ETS? Do you think we should also tax more kerosene, because at the moment kerosene is like an oil which is not really taxed, and it's actually acting as a subsidy to the aviation sector. Should we also target this?
Definitely. It was in our election movement in Sweden, and we were fighting and saying this is something we would like to get rid of. I mean, this is of course a very negative thing that we have this subsidy, that I actually would like to call it, on kerosene. And I think this is really like we are working in a good direction, and then on the other hand we are doing something that's completely against the transition that we would like to accomplish. And then I would like to also mention on the train, just very quick, I know you wanted to leave that, but I think it is really important that we see also that we need to connect the European Union with the railway, and that it has been very nationally oriented policy area, and that is a big problem. We have been binding the European Union and Europe together by aviation, and we didn't bind it together by train. And that is why it's such a very weird price signal, and there are so many obstacles for people who like to take the train, and more people should do that. And then I agree with Sylvia, who mentioned also we should not have it as an excuse, but it will be different between different member states, of course, because some member states it might be very relevant to bind together many member states, because the borders are so close together, and you should not take the aviation at all between some distance. That would not be very efficient, and it's also, when you think about greenhouse gases, it would not be sustainable at all. On the other hand, there are long distant countries where it would be like going through many borders, the north and south. I come from a country like that. And of course, there would be maybe a different situation for someone in the very north of Sweden, who likes to go to the southern part of Sweden. That's like taking a distance between different borders, I would say. I would just like to mention that, but I'm not saying that we should not get rid of these as well in the future by having better connections, but I'm saying that it's not only about borders, it's more about distance.
Thank you, Ms. Guteland. Before we move to the next block and the last block, I would like to hear from Nadine, because you've heard this discussion going on, and I guess you may have a reaction to this as well.
Yeah, I do actually. So I think it's great that we are talking about a potential ban of like domestic flights, especially within a country. And there are some supplementary measures like taking the train and incentivizing that price-wise. But that doesn't free us from addressing international aviation, and we have not talked about that really. And international aviation just has a huge impact CO2-wise, which is not comparable with domestic flights. So we need to address this. And opting in for the CORSIA scheme, I want to highlight again, there are studies saying this would lead to the biggest global increase in aviation CO2 emissions. And I think it would account for roughly 6% of projected CO2 emissions. So it's really little is being done about international aviation. And yeah, I just want to say it needs to be addressed, and I haven't heard much about that yet.
Thanks, Nadine. I would like also to show the live sketching that is going on behind the scenes. So if Anna would be able to show, what Fanny has done so far, it will also give us a bit of a material for discussion afterwards. So this is the process that is going on. It's actually really interesting. And I think, the question of fairness is really the one which we all emphasized. and the fact that all sectors need to be included, which will be addressed just afterwards. This looks really nice. Thank you, Fanny. And does anyone wants to give a very, very quick comment on what Nadine just touched upon? Because that's a very crucial topic, I think, but very fast.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead. Of course.
Yeah, I agree, and I think all of us probably agree. We need to tackle this. It is, as I understand it, the aviation pays for approximately 13% of its emissions, CO2, greenhouse gas emissions, and there is many problems with the current situation that they also have. As I understand it, with the system that is today, they have they don't pay for all the greenhouse gases, and therefore they also should actually pay double because they have double greenhouse gases that they should pay for. And therefore, I really would like to see a much better proposal from the Commission this time. And I really would like to see a ETS that is not excluding the international or giving them this loophole that they have been living under now. So we need to stop this. I don't know how I should describe it in Swedish. It would be easier, but it's like it's have been paralyzed since a very long time, and maybe because the international sector were extremely efficient in its lobbyism. The first time this scheme came to its place, they took away lots of momentum from the reform of CORSIA, and I think EU needs to say that we cannot be under this scheme and not develop our own ETS system that is much stronger in the future, because the way it is today, EU needs to be the pushing region here and say that we don't accept that we hide behind the international argument. I work more with the maritime sector, I must confess, but I see the same arguments in the maritime sector as in the aviation sector. So I think there are some parallels here.
Wow, that's amazing. Another great transition into the next block. Thank you very much for this, Ms. Guteland. Well, thanks also, Nadine, for your points. And now I would like to welcome another member of GCE, who is project co-lead on rail transport. Hi, Ruben. He will also give you a bit of an overview on the maritime transport before we can hear you MEPs more in details on this.
Yes, thank you. So by way of introduction, there are three main points that need to be made about the maritime sector. The first is that it is a hugely polluting industry. The second is that it's a polluting industry which continues to grow, not only in size of the sector, but also in size of its pollution. And three, that it's a sector of which the emissions are still very much unregulated. So in terms of the emissions, estimates from the International Maritime Organization predict that if we don't act now, that shipping emissions will be responsible for nearly 1/5 of all emissions worldwide by 2050. And that's not just a speculative increase, because that's an increase that's already happening now, not just in future. Between 2012 and 2018 alone, emissions in the maritime sector increased by 9.6%. And also for ships calling in European harbours, emissions increased by 86% by 2050 compared to 1990, if we leave the sector unregulated in terms of emissions. And regulatory action is particularly urgent in the shipping sector because of ships' long lifespan. And the technologies we invest in now, whether they're polluting technologies or green technologies, will be with us for a while because these ships simply last a long time. And despite all this, shipping is the only sector for which in terms of emissions, there's no regulatory action so far. And currently shipping is not included in the EU ETS at all. One key reason for the lack of EU regulation so far is that the International Maritime Organization has its own standards. And ideally, of course, cutting back on emissions would happen on a global level. And this is the discussion that Ms. Guteland just touched upon just now at the end. But it's evident that in terms of emissions, the IMO is not doing enough now. And for that reason, the Parliament voted by vast majority last year to include the maritime sector's CO2 emissions in the EU ETS. It's also made a proposition of what the funds gained through the ETS should be used for. So half would be used in an ocean fund to decarbonize the shipping sector itself. For example, that includes financing the protection and restoration of marine ecosystems. And the other half would go to financing tackling climate change more broadly in the EU. Of course, as with any ETS proposal, there are some key points of contention which arise in the shipping sector as well. And most notably, those questions are those of what's the total number of free allowances for the industry should be, if any, how long those allowances should remain for, and what the prices of allowances should be going forward. So I'll now pass over to our panel where we have some real experts on shipping who I'm sure will touch upon these issues and elaborate on why including shipping in the ETS is so important.
Thanks, Ruben. And actually, yeah, I think we have experts here on maritime transport, because the Ocean Fund you were touching upon is actually a proposal, if I'm not mistaken, was put forward by Ms. Guteland and Ms. Chabot. So maybe it would be interesting to hear about you, from you, Ms. Chabot, about this Ocean Fund and how you think it might address the conundrum we find ourselves in at the moment.
Yeah, thank you very much. Before answering your question, I just want to make a short comment. Charlie, you were speaking about the transfer impact on biodiversity when you were speaking about train. And don't forget that aviation and maritime transport have also impact on biodiversity. Don't forget that when we speak about the impacts, it's not only about emissions, but on water, on the ocean biodiversity. And don't forget, when we speak about maritime transport, that 90% of the goods and the objects you have around you right now transit by sea. So it's a very important issue. And before answering to the question of to the fund, the Ocean Fund, and I'm very proud of this fund, and I hope, I cross my finger, that we will keep it. It will be kept by after the trilogues, because it's not. I don't know if it will. First of all, let me tell you a bit about my personal experience and the convictions that drive me today. Even when we speak about maritime transport and the reduction of its emissions, and I can't speak about maritime transport without thinking about ocean issues. I am a sailor, and on my first solo Atlantic racing in 1991, I saw garbage in the middle of the ocean. I did not ask myself, where are the polluters? But how did we get there collectively? I felt a deep sense of individual and collective responsibility that has been with me ever since. And that is why I have launched 3 years ago an appeal for the ocean to be recognized as a global common at the global level. I want to give a voice to the ocean in the political sphere, which is unfortunately not known enough. At the same time, I believe our future is with the sea, and I am committed to promote a sustainable and integrated approach in our activities on and with the ocean. As we know, maritime transport participates to climate change and has negative impacts on the ocean, as Ruben told us. Therefore, the inclusion of shipping in the ETS would contribute to reduce these impacts. It would incentivize shipping companies to implement options to improve energy efficiency, such as alternative fuels, as their emissions will be capped and costly. An important point for me is the creation of this ocean fund dedicated to the sector and to develop the development of new technologies. It would help to accelerate the transition, but also to the protection, as you mentioned, restoration and management of marine ecosystems. As a competitor, I worked on my boat to be the fastest one. And at the same time, I wanted to respect the ocean. So I worked on a project, a boat for the future, to reduce the impacts on the sea from energy, materials to waste and water management. And with this example, I want to underline that solutions already exist. Innovative processes are necessary to encourage a sustainable industry, and technology transfer from selling to shipping must be promoted. I know a lot of them, such as wind propulsion and better energy efficiency. It must be a priority for the EU to invest in the European green ship industry, from eco-design ships, for example, with the new hull and engines designs, to ship renovation and dismantlement. We not often speak about the dismantlement of the boats. I believe the recovery plan is also an opportunity for the EU to focus on modernizing and greening its shipbuilding yards and promote the development of decarbonized technologies. In the post-COVID and recovery context, I also support the greater cooperation at EU level. For example, I don't know if you have heard about this project, Canopy. It is the sailboat that will carry the Ariane rockets, which was designed in France, built in Poland and the Netherlands, with the help of Germany. So the EU has the capacities to become a sustainable mobility champion and should not wait for China and Japan to take this leadership. And this project, Canopy, has not been built as a cooperation inside EU, but it is one. So I think we have to strengthen cooperation. Finally, we have to be coherent, and I would like to underline with our objectives and policies. One cannot promote decarbonized transport while using Arctic roads to transport goods, because climate change opened this new way. We certainly must avoid creating polar maritime highways to ensure sustainable transport. That would be my final word, and I can answer other questions if you have some. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Chabot. I think the last point you touched upon is really important as well from a geopolitical point of view. But to rather stay on the EU context itself, I also think, and that's actually a question I'm asking you, Ms. Guteland, as you also bear this project for the Ocean Funds. Isn't there also a challenge to relocalize our activities in Europe to simply reduce the amount of goods that comes from other parts of the world into Europe? You mentioned, Ms. Chabot, China, for example. While we are importing a lot of goods from China, but not only from China, from the US as well, from other parts of the world, isn't there also a challenge here and also building new industrial capacity in Europe?
First of all, I think, this question is, of course, linked to the transport sector in the maritime. And I believe we are not paying enough for the transport part of the import. I really believe that this needs to be better in the circularity model, it needs to be also counted in this calculation, what is polluting in the whole chain from when the goods are produced until we consume it, and then back into the system. So I really believe the transport sector today is a weak spot, and we need to also regulate it. And then if we speak about the transport sector or the maritime sector, I agree to many of the things that Catherine has mentioned, and I also appreciate the experience and knowledge from your background as a sailor. I think that's very valuable in the political debate. But from my point of view, I just been more and more aware about how this sector is so unregulated compared to others, and that they have been literally sailing under the radar for a very long time, and saying that the IMO should do this by itself, and the EU as a region should be really careful. And I think since I've been in delegation going to MEPC meetings, the environmental conference every year that is held often in London and now digitally, that meeting, that conference shows that it's not happening fast enough. It's the same arguments every year, that this should be done in the international level, in the UN body, IMO, but that UN body is not sharp enough at this moment. And I had this very, very strong feeling when there was a politician, he is not alive anymore, and a man from 2015, I think, when I visited this conference, he came as minister from the Marshall Islands, and he said that we are desperate now. The climate policy needs to improve, and the shipping sector needs to take its contribution into this, because we are literally sinking, and we are having also, I don't think that's what the argument he said. He said we are not surviving on the way we could survive before, because of we have more storms in May than we normally have in August before. The storm starts in the springtime and they continue the whole year. So we cannot take ships into our port because of this, and there are many problems that we are facing because of these extreme weathers that the climate change and the global heating is causing the earth. So he said, I'm coming here, normally there is the businessman coming, but I'm coming here as a minister, and as I would like to come here and tell that for us this is about surviving, and please do more in the maritime sector. And I think he convinced to the IMO to start this debate, but it's very sad because there's many years since this very dramatic intervention from him, and from EU was actually supporting his intervention, but we are still not there. We don't have the ETS yet, and we have not the target that is sharp for this sector. We don't have the price mechanism. So I really believe that the Commission can do a very important step this summer. And I have great expectations that finally we will have something here. And I worked with many of the colleagues here to try to push the Commission to delivering, because we as legislators, we cannot work if we don't have proposals on the table. So we need to have a good proposal on the table also.
Thank you, Ms. Gutteland. Any words from you, Ruben, maybe to come back on the two previous statements that were made for our MEPs?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, it's great to hear also from Ms. Chabot on the use of existing technologies. I think it's very important to hear in mind that innovation isn't necessarily about looking for brand new technologies which have never been used before, but also about using existing knowledge more effectively. And another question I would ask perhaps to Ms. Gutteland is, or to anyone else, is that shipping also contributes to other very dirty air pollutants besides carbon emissions, also to sulfur oxide and nitrous oxide. Do you think that the EU ETS, if we get an EU ETS on shipping, should include those gases too?
Yes, I actually think so. We have actually amended that before, so that would be a good step to do everything at once, kind of, and not wait. But I'm always knowing also that it's always a fight every time. So we will see also what we get to work with. But I think it's a good proposal.
And Ms. Chabot, yeah, no problem. You can jump in.
Yeah, to answer the question, in the MFA regulation, we asked for the extension of NECA's area. You know, I think we must transform Europe in a whole NECA's zone, you know, without the other emissions. And we asked the regulation to count not only the CO2 emissions, but also the nitrox, the others, all the others. So it's a big thing. I think if the GCE, you should push and help us because the problem with maritime transport and with all ocean issues is that they are not in the scope of the Commission. And that's the problem of the ocean issues. I can, for example, the Vice President, Franz Timmermans, who is in charge of climate issues, never speaks about ocean. And I'm a co-founder of the Ocean and Climate Platform. We founded in 2014 to make to put the ocean in the climate negotiation, because just before the COP21, the ocean was never mentioned in the negotiation. So, and now we are very happy because 2 or 3 weeks ago, the United Nations provided a report saying that ocean action is climate action. So we have to push for the creation of the Ocean Fund, even if a lot of our colleagues don't really agree with that. Why? Because these resources will provide the own resources of the EU. So, but my feeling and I'm convinced that if we don't create an ocean fund, ocean will never be included in the scope. When we speak about nature-based solution and nature protection, we speak about the forests, and never about the marine and coastal ecosystems. So another example, I'm trying to push the idea, and I'm happy to share that with all my colleagues here, the idea to promote the blue carbon in the implementation of the climate law. And I work with my colleague Pascal Canfin, who is the president of our ENVI committee, and trying to find a solution to push the blue carbon inside the implementation. And I'm happy to share this idea with you, Jutta, because I think it's. And if you want to have more details, I will be happy to share them with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have also a very interesting question from the public, which is actually quite long, but we'll try to put it on screen either way. The idea is actually draws back on the point that you made earlier. And I think we'll take very short comments from Mr. Bloss and Ms. Modig on that before we close. Within maritime transportation, we have already existing alternatives. You made it very clear, things that already exist and that we are able to put actually into place. So shouldn't we, rather than integrating the maritime transport into the EU ETS, try to give subsidies or actually incentives to companies or other bodies to make sure that those existing alternatives can be fastened and can actually be scaled up, to make sure that even if we keep some maritime transport because it's needed in some way, then we can make sure it emits less GHG emission and also has less impact on the biosphere. So I will put the question here. It's quite long. I'm sorry. So yeah, briefly, what do you think about this divide between innovation on the one side and using better existing alternatives on the other side? Mr. Bloss first.
Yeah, for me, it's again a bit of the question between regulatory policies and market-based solutions. We know that the price elasticity of shipping is around 300 euros. So if the CO2 price is at around 300 euros, then it would be economical for ship owners to change. But we won't see, if we include it into the ETS, we won't see prices of 300 euros. That means we will have little incentives for them to change. So we need to actually have other things than you speak about support, subsidies, of course. I'm always cautioning here a bit because this is, taxpayers' money and this is private companies and they actually make profits with it. So they can invest themselves because they will make profit with it anyway later. So what we can still do is use regulatory policies, what we already do. For instance, what kind of ships can actually land in European harbors? Can, when they are in the harbor, they have to use electricity from the land, not from their engines. So all of these kind of regulatory policies, I think, are also very useful. I don't see a big risk of carbon leakage because it's still like the prices they have to pay for the CO2 emissions or like the change of technology are very cheap compared to them going to different harbors and then bringing it via road transport or so. So I think regulatory politics in this realm works quite well. And I would be also like focusing on this because with the market, it's difficult or we should have a separate ETS for shipping that actually brings prices of 1 ton of CO2 up to 300 euros. Then it could be also effective, but including it will not be very much effective.
Thank you. Closing words, Ms. Modig?
Well, I don't have much to add to Misha's very good intervention there. I think we need all options open on the table. I don't think they exclude each other. But as Misha said, I also think that this is taxpayers' money. When we put out the incentive with taxpayers' money, I don't want the taxpayers to pay for all this transition that is needed, because we put a good incentive, the companies will themselves make the investments needed because that is where their profit will be. And that is the capitalistic world. The companies move very quickly to where the profit is the biggest. So we should use that angle, but not, of course, take away the other regulatory measures.
Perfect. Thank you very much. You've been concise and very precise. Thanks. Actually, I'm seeing the clock turning, and we are touching upon the end of this dialogue. So I'd like to thank you again. And before we leave, I would like to show what Fanny has done during the last 30 minutes to also show you a bit visually how this looks like. And Fanny, if you want to say a few words, feel free.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie, and thank you to the whole GCE team. You did an amazing job, and yeah, it's been also a good way to learn more about the topic and to discover also the different issues. So big thank you to all of you.
Thank you very much, Fanny. And thank you again to all of you MEPs who could join us today, and to the audience that also followed us and was really interesting in their questions and comments, which we would not be able to address all, but thank you very much for being that interactive. And please follow us on our social media, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. Facebook as well, to be updated on the future events. I can already tell you that we'll have a second iteration of this dialogue in September. And this time we'll tackle the very hot topic as well of agriculture and the carbon farming initiative. So thank you again, Mr. Bloss, Ms. Modig, Ms. Guteland, Ms. Chabot, for coming tonight. And we'll have a nice end of the evening. And we'll also be in touch in the following weeks to make sure that we can dive a bit deeper into those topics during the private sessions, during which we'll be very happy to talk to you more about this. Thank you again, and have a nice evening.
Thank you to everyone. Bye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.